This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Welcome back to The Common Denominator. We meet you today in a world that keeps upping the ante. We awake each morning to read the news and become freshly appalled and alarmed at what unexpected twist we've turned. We're flooded online with a dialogue at a decibel so unhinged you can't pull yourself away from the train wreck of it, never mind succeed in bringing any nuance to the conversation. But this vitriol comes with real-life consequences and the emboldened action to plan and do harm. One of the fundamental reasons we initiated the Common Denominator is out of the need, the very long need, to bring the perspective of the Israeli people to the discussion. The real live people of flesh, who for all the incessant talking about us, few have ever heard from us about us, or our experiences and perspectives in the mainstream dialogue. In my personal experience, I found people across the world were highly curious to hear from Israelis on any criticisms of our government, of which we have not a few. These criticisms are taken immediately and at face value. However, when we wish to explain what is entirely unique to our people and place, it's often dismissed as propaganda. The lack of curiosity to learn the truth in lieu of lopsided, villainous, all-bad entity has brought us to the brink today. It's my belief that an entirely different language is required to tell our tale. For the language presently utilized by the masses leaves the lived and historical experience of the Jews in Israel out of the story, and it implies inherent guilt and wrongdoing. It's my belief that the world has very little understanding of the Jewish experience, of who we are, what's unique to our nation, and how that guides us. The world requires, and rather urgently, an understanding of the myriad presentations of the Jews and the Israeli state. The word Israel alone has any number of meanings. What I see repeatedly on social media are Jews who are utterly baffled by what's said of us, so contrary is it to the source of our intentions. That leaves a gaping hole of the entire other side of the story, so to speak, without which not one of us can arrive at a place of coherence. It's the common denominator's objective to identify and describe Israel in its many manifestations of state and peoplehood and faith. In order to do so, we need to teach a new language. The rancor we see now on display is not criticism of Israel and its response to the atrocities of October 7th. We see a delegitimizing and dehumanizing of the state of Israel. Accusations that Israel is an imperialist, colonialist, genocidal country, and that did not begin on October 8th. These are deliberate, specific, and targeted attacks developed decades ago to mask anti-Semitism in the cloak of criticism of Zionism. It's with this that we could not be more delighted to welcome scholar of Anti-Zionism and contemporary left anti-Semitism and contributing writer to Tablet magazine, Izabella Tabarovsky. Isabella, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me, Ilana. It's a pleasure.
So diving right in, we're talking about establishing definitions. We hear the vitriol spat out in the word Zionism. It's become a dirty word. So let's start perhaps with your definition of what this word Zionism means.
So first of all, I want to comment on your introduction. I think it's so spot on because as a scholar of anti-Zionist propaganda, it's very clear to me that what we're hearing today it's a language. It doesn't define Zionism, just as you said. It's language that has been contaminated and distorted by state agents, by state actors that used propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, to achieve their specific political agendas, for foreign policy purposes, even domestic policy purposes. So it's the manipulation of the language to achieve political purposes. So Zionism, to me, is very simply the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our land, in the land of Israel. So it's a pretty simple and straightforward definition. But look at what we are hearing today online and wherever, outside on campuses, in the streets of American and European cities, that Zionism is racism. Zionism is settler colonialism. Zionism is fascism. Zionism is Nazism. And then there's a whole series of epithets applied to Israel, that it's an apartheid state, that it's a Nazi, that it's like Nazi Germany. So all of this is a redefinition. And at this point, it has become so deeply inculcated that it's very hard to convince people who are already convinced that this is what it is. And so then the question that then arises for me is, who is our target audience here, really? Do we want to try to convince those who are already convinced to change their minds? Or do we just work with those who don't yet know or are not yet convinced? Because I think that some people think that what we're hearing today is something new. You often hear people talk about it's a new anti-Semitism, or it's a new form of anti-Jewish hate. But the thing is, there's nothing new about it. And that is the problem. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I lived in the US for 30 years. But in the USSR of the 70s and 80s, this was the language that you heard. This is where it comes from. That's the source. And so there's nothing new about it. And as Jews, as former Soviet Jews, we know what terrible consequences this language has. And this is why I've been writing about it, and I've been warning American Jews about it. And it was very hard for them, I think, to believe that this anti-Zionist, anti-Israel language is as dangerous as, for example, the language of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But they're deeply intertwined, and we can get into that in the conversation if you want to. But this is really where my thoughts are right now.
I completely agree with the definition, the self-determination in our land. To me, as really feeling like kind of a simple Jew, it's baffling to me the villainization of the word Zionism, because it seems a really very simple desire that every people has. No matter where you move to, you have the memories of your land, of your food, of the trees that you climbed. And so it seems to me an entirely basic and very sort of fundamental human experience. Izabella, tell us first, what was it like being a Jew in the former Soviet Union?
Well, look, it's a complex story, because it differed depending on when you lived there. So I was born in 1970, so I came of age like in the 70s and 80s. And basically, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, we emigrated to the US. At that time, it wasn't as dangerous to be a Jew as, for example, it was during certain periods of time under Stalin, for example, in the late 40s and early 50s, when there were massive anti-Semitic campaigns. But what happened by the 70s and 80s is that Jews were supposed to have become assimilated. They basically had already killed all of the Jewish culture and Jewish and religion and tradition. And so growing up Jewish in the USSR at that time, you didn't really even know what it meant. It depended a little bit on where you grew up. Like if you were growing up in certain parts of Ukraine or the Baltic republics especially, which became part of the USSR later, so they weren't so Sovietized, not as much as some other parts of the country. But where I was growing up, we were, on the one hand, entirely assimilated. We didn't know Yiddish or Hebrew. There was no way really to learn it legally. No synagogues. I grew up in Novosibirsk. No knowledge about Israel. No Jewish history taught, no Jewish culture. And yet you always knew that you were Jewish. And that was kind of the paradox of the Soviet Jewish identity. They identified you. When I first came to the US, it was hard for me to explain to American Jews, how is it that people identified you as a Jew? And I would say, well, they would do it by looking at my face. And they would look at me and they would say, well, what do you mean? Like, if I look at you, how does a Jew look? And that's a real sort of cultural divide, because in the USSR, basically, it was a country that was very focused on people's ethnicities for historical reasons. And I think that the first thought that people have when they look at you or looked at you was, well, what is your nationality? And for a person with my look, kind of a stereotypical Jewish nose, kind of Mediterranean features, I guess you could say, I could be nothing but Jewish. And so and then of course also they recorded your Jewishness in your passport, in your internal passport. Everybody's nationality or ethnic identity was recorded that way. But if you were a Jew, and it was written on your face and it was written in your ID, then certain opportunities were closed. And you were always conscious of that. You always realized that, you understood it. You were subjected to taunting in the streets. And what's important is that these are the years when the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign hits a high gear, and it's this international campaign that demonizes Zionism, precisely the terms that you were talking about in your introduction. And this is what's so interesting about the Soviet Jewish experience in those years that I think a lot of people don't understand, is that the state-sponsored anti-Semitism that was part of our lives was expressed in anti-Zionist terms. It was expressed in anti-Israel terms. And so, which is how we know as Soviet Jews, we all know that once this language appears, Jews will be demonized along with Zionism and Israel, and nobody will care what your opinion is on Israel or Zionism. Everybody will be demonized. Your opportunities will be limited, and they can be limited in different ways. But right now, for example, what's happening to American Jews, it's very similar to what happened to Soviet Jews. So there are limitations in the academy, there are limitations in professional fields. We see Jews being expelled, maybe not in the US yet, but in other countries, being expelled if they express support for Israel. So being expelled from sports teams. So very similar consequences. And so what happened then is that in the end, you couldn't always emigrate from the USSR. The exits were closed for a big part of the time. But once the exits opened, basically all Soviet Jews left. The vast majority of Soviet Jews left. And that is really the biggest indication of what anti-Zionism does to Jewish life.
Which is the perfect example, which is that no one had any illusions. None of the Jews living in Soviet Russia had any illusions about the semantics. They were perfectly aware that whatever you want to call it, it was plain old and simple anti-Jew hate. Izabella, the bulk of your work talks about, one of the things that struck me so much was this idea of Russia's role in 1967 proxy war and their development, their inheritance, as it were, even though they're now defunct, but the long lives on their legacy of anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses. Please speak to that. I'd love to hear.
Sure. Well, and first of all, I want to say, people often say, just the other day, somebody said to me on X, on Twitter, well, sure, the USSR no longer exists and you keep blaming them for all of the ills. And I say, well, sure, Nazi Germany doesn't exist either, but the Nazi ideology very much exists and prospers. We understand that when we speak about Nazi ideology. Well, it's the same with call it Soviet or communist ideology. Communist ideology was always hostile to Zionism, and there were many reasons for that. Even if you look even at the early writings by Lenin and Stalin, you see a hostility to Zionism, and it's both theoretical and practical. And I'm not going to get into it in details, but on a very basic level, Zionism is nationalism and communism is internationalism. And so one of the arguments they put up was that, well, we are only free. Each of us is free is only when everybody's free, which is basically today's slogan as well. It comes as part of intersectionality today, but back then it came as part of kind of the general Marxist understanding, proletarians of all countries unite. But so the opposition, the Soviet communist opposition to Zionism evolved over the years, and it became progressively more conspiracist. And this is what's really important. So when they opposed Zionism in the 1920s, you can disagree with them. If you don't buy into the Marxist perspective on the world, then you disagree with them. That's fine. There is logic to it. It's not conspiracist. They sort of view Zionism as it is still. But then as you progress through the 30s and 40s, Stalin's period, it becomes progressively more conspiracist. And then you get to 1967. And what happens in 1967 is that Israel, of course, wins in this war against Arab states, which were financed and trained by the Soviets. And the Soviets don't understand how is it that such a small country like Israel could win over these much more powerful Arab states, much more numerous, and trained and financed by them. And from there, a conspiracy theory is born, and it literally was conspiracies. The KGB really believed that there was a Zionist conspiracy against the Soviet Union. And who was part of this conspiracy? The United States, of course, was the biggest part of this conspiracy. And Zionists owned and controlled the United States. They controlled American media and American politicians and American finances. And at the same time, Zionists were sort of the tool of imperialism in the Middle East. And so who the USSR faced in the Middle East in reality was not just tiny Israel, but the mighty United States. Now, it has to be said that in 1967, the United States did not support Israel, but the Soviets believed that it was a full-blown conspiracy theory. And so at that point, this is when they really begin to redefine Zionism officially, and they begin a full-blown propaganda campaign which goes internationally. So again, this is the significance of 1967. So before they were anti-Zionist, and under Stalin even there were conspiracist notes, but it mostly remained internal, or some of it kind of spilled over into Eastern European states. But in 1967 it goes global, and they begin to target really the entire world, because they believe that Zionists own the entire world, so they need to confront Zionists all around the world. And so they sponsored something like 75 to 80 various leftist groups, communist parties, workers' parties around the globe, literally gave them money so that they could publish the same things that the Soviets published. As part of their broader propaganda campaign, they would also publish articles demonizing Zionism. There were the KGB carried out what's known as active measures, which is sort of actions that are meant to kind of manipulate reality in a way that would fit the needs of the KGB and of the United States. So, for example, one well-known active measure that they undertook was they forged letters, claimed that these letters were written by Zionist leaders, and sent them to various leaders of the Black community. And these were really deeply racist letters. These were forgeries. But what this was meant to do was to undermine the relationship between Jews and African Americans, and to confirm the Soviet point that Zionists were racists. So there were numerous active measures like this that they undertook. And this is really where it begins.
Tell me more, Izabella, about what happened on U.S. campuses. And do you think it's the same story up until this moment, or has it changed, or are we just running straight through for 50 years?
Well, look, my assumption is that when you look, because I've looked not only at the Soviet press from that time, but I've also been looking at what were the various communist publications, leftist publications publishing at that time abroad. And I'm most only looking at English. It's really important to understand that the Soviets were directing this propaganda in like dozens of languages, to dozens of countries. I'm only looking at English. So you can see the same ideas circulating. And so my theory, which I believe to be correct, is that in the 70s and 80s, these ideas about Zionism begin to penetrate the progressive left-wing circles. And I think that at the time, this is the Cold War, the far left is really on the fringes. Nobody likes the communists, right? So they're kind of in their own world. They're on the fringes. But it becomes a really an inseparable part of the package of causes that you assume if you join the left. What is the cause? The cause is that as a leftist, you are against Zionism. You view Israel as a reactionary state that is simultaneously like apartheid South Africa and Nazi Germany. So you assume the pro-Palestinian stance. Pro-Palestinian, I always I think it's a misnomer. It's one of the things, one of the many misnomers in the language that we're using that needs to be corrected, because I don't think that what these groups are proposing actually helps Palestinians. I think certainly right now, what they're proposing would help Hamas and not the actual people on the ground. But for the purposes of our discussion, so you assume that whatever passes for pro-Palestinian cause. And so somehow this continues, this remains. So the Soviet Union falls apart, but this remains part of the left-wing discourse and part of the left-wing attitude. And it's interesting because even though there are some splits that occur in the 70s and 80s, and some left-wing groups position themselves as being anti-Soviet, but when you look at their publications, even though they're generally anti-Soviet, when it comes to Israel and Zionism, they speak in the very same language that the Soviets invented, essentially. And so then somehow, how it then reemerges on American campuses more recently, I think that requires more study. But I do know that when I look at what's circulating on the internet today, I see a lot of those old Soviet materials, literal Soviet materials. Again, I see them in English. I'm sure they appear in lots of other languages as well. They are just being recirculated. And nobody knows anymore that they originate with the USSR. So, for example, I saw one publication which has the same name as a publication that the Communist Party of the United States used to put out, which was sponsored by the Soviets financially. Now I don't know who sponsors them, but they republished a book that was produced, they serialized it into 3 articles, that was produced, literally, we know it from declassified materials. It was produced with Soviet help. We know that the author of the book traveled to Moscow, specifically requesting help in producing this book. He said he wanted to write a book about Zionism and its reactionary nature. And the Soviet comrades say, of course, we'll help you. These are like super senior Soviet comrades, members of the Communist Party, the Central Committee. So now this book appears on this website. The children don't know. Whoever is reading this don't know how it was produced. They don't know that they're literally reading the KGB propaganda. So this stuff is circulating. It's out there. It's just one example. It's completely out there.
And this concept that it was my understanding that the Soviets actually infiltrated U.S. campuses with flyers saying things like the exact same slogans we hear today, Zionism, apartheid, and that an entire academia was really invented at that time in the 70s, where professors were paid for by the former Soviet Union until people began to quote each other, until an entire academia was created, of which I understand Abu Mazen has an actual PhD in. Is that correct?
So there are a couple things here. So how it penetrated American campuses, I can't say specifically. I know that the Soviets produced little brochures. Sure. I have a ton of these brochures that they produced in English and that they distributed actively abroad. This we know for sure. And I absolutely would not be surprised if brochures like this found their way to American campuses. I know that somebody from South Africa just told me that when he was growing up in South Africa, these Novosti brochures, Novosti was the publisher, the Soviet publisher, they were everywhere on his campus. So for sure, in student groups and leftist student groups, I have no doubt that they were there. The extent to which they co-opted the professors, I'm sure, again, it was some probably were co-opted. I don't know if it needs to be more, it needs to be investigated much more, because we know that some professors certainly traveled to the USSR, and we know that whenever you went to the USSR, you were always, if you were of interest to the authorities, they would show you a Potemkin village, kind of a made up front facade, and then try to recruit you to be on their side. So that was there. If you look, for example, at Angela Davis, here's an example. Angela Davis was completely part of that Soviet system. She was part of the CPUSA, Communist Party of the United States of America. which was financed by the Soviet Union. So she was a beneficiary of that system. And she, of course, is a professor. I don't know how long she's been a professor, but she teaches on American campuses. And she still holds the same beliefs. She still holds the same anti-Zionist beliefs that she held in the 1970s. The USSR invested a lot into her image, into promoting her, into turning her into the spokesperson for the causes that the Soviets wanted to be, for her to be speaking and addressing and expressing. So, but what with Abu Mazen, that's related, but that's about the Soviet Academy. The Soviet propagandists drew the Soviet Academy into their anti-Zionist campaign because they realized that they needed to give it heft, and they wanted to sound scholarly. They wanted to sound like there was some scientific objective reality to what they were saying about Zionism, that it wasn't just propaganda. And so they just drew in, this is something that I realize that sometimes I forget, that a lot of people don't really realize how the USSR worked. It was a state in which everything was subjected to the interests of the center, right? A completely centralized state. And so, and the academy was certainly that way. And certainly the social sciences and humanities departments were very much driven by the ideological needs of the state. And so at some point in the early 70s, they begin to establish departments whose task is to create materials that will make it sound like Zionism is in fact racism, as if it's some kind of objective scholarly reality. And when Abu Mazen comes to the USSR to defend his dissertation, which he defended in 82, he lands in one of these institutions. He's actually connected to two institutions. One is the Patrice Lumumba University of Friendship of the Peoples, but he defends his dissertation somewhere else at the Institute of Oriental Studies. And both were part of this network of kind of building, creating, and reinforcing and enhancing the anti-Zionist echo chamber. And so when you look at the dissertation that he produced, and I've looked at the introduction, basically the summary of the dissertation, because the entire text is not available. It's still classified in the USSR. But the 19 pages that are available, you look at the footnotes, you look at what he's quoting, and it's all of these Soviet propagandists who created this anti-Zionist language. And so then that's where it becomes the echo chamber that you were asking about. Then Abu Mazen goes back and he then translates, communicates all of these ideas to his people in his environment. And I'm sure that, this is where also another channel of communication happens with the Western leftists, who also become close to the Palestinian, to the PLO, and then to the Palestinian Authority. So then they hear it from them as well. And so it becomes this circular quoting. It's like it comes at them from here, it comes at them from there. And they think, well, of course it's true. Zionism is racism and Israel is an apartheid state. So
it's incredible. I think that I've actually often said that that's a silver lining, perhaps, of being a Jew, that you can never kind of go too far, maybe not never, but it keeps you from going too far off of any deep ends, because you watch in real time them take a thread of fact out of time and context and genuinely weave an entirely different narrative. I have felt so many different things, but certainly my frustration with thinking, why hasn't even the state of Israel done more to confront this? Because at this point, you're talking about a weaving of a narrative that is absolutely the thickest web. It feels virtually impossible to approach, and that's exactly what we're doing. Let's pull out thread by thread and put it back in order and put it back in context. There's several things that you said I really want to address, but the thing that's coming up right now is, and you said it somewhere else before, and I have done a lot of previous work on the psychological warfare of these online social media platforms and what they're degrading our ability for analysis and for human contact and many of these things, which is for another upcoming discussion. But what I think you said it much better than I actually ever have is because when I was watching early on in the war, you'd see somebody's comment on Twitter and you went into the comments and you were bombarded, whether it was AI or not, even though I don't for a moment imagine that there's very real suffering happening. But you are confronted with these horrific images that on a biological, visceral level, you cannot help but react to. You absolutely react. And you said it so perfectly, which was that once you have already the emotion, it's almost impossible to bring fact to change someone's mind. And many people said to me early on, you can't change people's opinions with facts. And I think that you really nail it there. If there's anything you want to, that just people have this feeling that something's off. Just have a peek at any historical reality, and you can pick all of this apart really in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this part is really crucial. The understanding the difference between addressing something factually versus addressing something on an emotional level. I don't know if it's versus. I'm not sure if it's versus. I think it has to be both. But what we do need to understand, and this is something that propagandists understand really well, certainly Soviet propagandists understood it well, is that when you're trying to influence someone, you're trying to influence them on an emotional level, because that is the deepest level at which a person can be influenced. And an emotional impact is almost impossible to undo or unwind. Certainly, it's impossible to unwind it with facts. I'll give you an example. This is precisely what Soviet propagandists would do. Here, it just happened, but this is like a classic case. What happened with the Al-Ahli hospital, right? Al-Ahli, I think it was called. I apologize if I mispronounce it, but that's a hospital that was reported to have been bombed by Israelis. And as soon as it was bombed, somehow it was immediately reported that 500 people were murdered. And it was such a massive shock. It was very early in the war. The New York Times reported this on their front page. They posted a picture that wasn't even a picture of the hospital. It was something else. They posted it for illustration purposes, as if they didn't understand or didn't think that this is what people will think, that this massive crater is what's left of a hospital. Massive shock for everyone. What happens later? Turns out that it wasn't Israel, it was Islamic Jihad. It wasn't the hospital, it was the hospital's parking lot. And it wasn't 500 people, but I don't know, like a couple dozen people got injured, right? So not 500 murdered, but a couple dozen got injured. How many people do you think read that news? And how many people actually changed their mind? I mean, they might have changed their mind about that one instance, but the emotional impact of the first fake news reporting was far more powerful in creating a feeling that Israel is a monster, Israel is conducting a genocide, so this kind of stuff is very hard to undo with facts. And the Soviets understood it very well.
They're masters of it, really. Soviet propaganda is masterful. I mean, out of anyone. I imagine that they were behind much of what was online. They have 100% won the war online. I mean, it is devastating to see it.
Well, exactly. If the internet existed in those years, they would have been. But Russian propaganda is using the internet as much as it can, and there are other state actors that use now the same propaganda, like the Chinese are using the same propaganda that the Soviets produced on their own. But what I wanted to say also is that on the question of Israel doing a better job in responding to this kind of propaganda, there's always room for improvement, but I also think that it's very hard to defeat what we're facing. Because why is that? Because what we're facing, I go back to what I said earlier, that it is grounded in conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theory is notoriously hard to defeat. And part of the reason it's hard to defeat is that conspiracy theorists take anything you tell them and they incorporate it into their conspiracy theory, or the conspiracy theory adjusts to the new situation. And so it doesn't matter what we do or say, it will be distorted and it will be turned against us. A good recent example is when there was the raid to save the 2 hostages just recently in Rafah. It's so interesting how immediately, as soon as it happened, the first thing we hear online is that This was a genocidal Israel attacking defenseless Palestinians in Rafah. You don't even hear anything about the hostages. Or, this is my favorite part, that the IDF launched this attack specifically at the time when Americans were watching the Super Bowl to distract, so they wouldn't be paying attention. It's so absurd and ridiculous. But this is how conspiracist mind works. And so here, it's like here was an obvious story, a positive story, right? We are saving our hostages. But even that was turned against us and turned into this conspiracist perspective. So in a way, I think it doesn't matter. I mean, look, when Israelis go out, when Israeli government goes out and talks about, for example, and Israelis, not just the government, but people talk about the progressive LGBTQ agenda in Israel. People call it pinkwashing. They say that you're using it to distract attention from what you're doing to Palestinians. So it doesn't matter what we do. It will always be turned against us. So I think, again, I think the question is, who do we address? I don't know if we can defeat the propagandists and the radicals. There are too many of them. They're too well financed. They're too convinced. I think we really need to be turning our attention to people who are on the fence, or certainly people who are our friends. We need to be talking to them. We need to make sure that they understand the truth, that they're armed with facts. I think that is really crucial.
I think that the past 4 years have been so extraordinary. With the onset of Corona and all that brought in our whole entire lives. Before that, we used to say, oh gosh, I shouldn't carry my cell phone around. And now it's not even, nobody even pretends like they're not all the time living on their phone. Banking is moving on to phones. Everything is moving on to these cell phones, which carries. And I don't think that we have, nobody checked the label, as it were. We didn't have a discussion as a society. And we are right now, at this moment, living the fallout of what it means to have these social, human, herd beings of 5 senses moved online, subjected to relentless fear and terror of various natures. And then we just flipped the switch. I felt like I kept calling this initially a world pivot. Wow, we flipped this switch of Corona, which changed our lives. And now, just like that, we've convinced the world to all but just being on board with destroying the state of Israel and all that it means. And for all its imperfections, it's a work in progress. And I think that that's actually one of the biggest mistakes that modern world made, was this idea that the democracies that we so thoroughly enjoyed and so thoroughly did not appreciate in the West were a finished product, right? Done deal. All of that's behind us, wipe our hands of it, right? No more racism. The whole point is being sold to us as a finished product and not a goal to attain and to have accountability for and to adjust and be dynamic and work with and grow with, was the greatest mistake, I think, that we made in the West, as opposed to saying, because you don't have China beating their chest for all their many mistakes that they've made in the world and to their people, So the whole point of taking accountability was really what we should have sold people in the West, as opposed to, ting, period, at the end of the sentence, we're done here. And I will say as well, which was what I had wanted to also about the wishing Israel had done more. I do say, in our defense, as Jews watching it, I think that we really could not have imagined. No one is naive so much about the anti-Semitism, but that people would be able to believe such obvious lies, like what happened in that hospital. I still see people quoting that today. And that's of course been the MO of the vast majority of news stations, which is, let's quick blast the most inflammatory, accusatory, like there are no holds barred. There are no more rules of journalism. There's no more oaths of professionalism to the people. We go with the most inflammatory story, and then later we issue a whoops correction. That's been the MO throughout all of this. And I think that we didn't account for, in the light of all the psychological warfare, I feel like, that we've experienced online, and this change of how easy it would be to believe things that are so obviously not true.
Well, yeah. Exactly. And I just want to say on this, I think the willingness of Western media to jump on the most horrific stories, right? Stories that present Israelis as complete and utter monsters. I think it demonstrates it's the conditioning that's been going on for years. I keep kind of pounding on this point or emphasizing this point that it's not new. It's not something that's just happening all of a sudden today. A lot of people are like, where did it come from? Well, it's been there. There are articles. I don't know if you know Mati Friedman. He is a writer and an Israeli journalist. He's written some really excellent articles from his personal experience about how Western media report about Israel. And he really makes it so clear that they're essentially always prepared to believe the most horrendous lie about Israel. And that's why they're jumping. There is no there's no room for to consider maybe it's not true. It's just they just jump on it. Right. And I want to go back to your point about democracies. I mean, I find it so frustrating, again, because as someone who grew up in the USSR, and for us always, the United States certainly was the beacon of hope and the beacon of light. And this is what we discovered when we left. We came in 1990, still from behind the Iron Curtain. It was a complete cultural shock. But the thing that really amazed me about America is you really sensed the freedom. You really sensed the liberty to be who you wanted to be. And it was hard and you had to work for it. You realized just what an incredible country of opportunities it is. I remember taking courses in school and being exposed to various thinkers and writers and filmmakers. And so it was a course in intellectual history. And I remember thinking, my God, why was it all prohibited from me? Why couldn't I see it before? If I had read it or seen it before, I would have been a different person. But I couldn't. It was all prohibited in the USSR. So the US was this beacon of hope. And so today, when I hear the young people talk about what a horrible country it is, I just think, well, you've never lived in a really horrible country. You don't know what it's like to really not have freedom. And I come to the conclusion that somehow we in the democratic societies have failed to learn how to defend our democracy against these kinds of attacks from within. The attacks that seek to undermine the very fabric of the society. So there's some failure there to communicate the greatness of the society, call it patriotic values. I know it's deeply unfashionable to talk about patriotism, but I think that it's crucial. It's crucial in the United States. You see how important it is in Israel. And somehow we need to return to this because democracies actually turns out to be very fragile. They're fragile if you convince a lot of people to believe that they live in a terrible society. Well, then the society will actually undermine itself. And I think we need to make sure that we win that war kind of for the minds, I guess, of the next generation.
I think that's exactly spot on. And that goes back to what I was saying about the idea of accountability. When I'm accountable, it's mine. I have a part in it. Yeah, everybody knows democracy isn't perfect. For right now, it's what we got and we need to make use of it. And it shows what you said earlier about the exact antithesis of centralized power, where you have one narrative and it is applied throughout. It is one gush, it is one trunk where all branches come from. And that is exactly the beauty, this sort of whatever it is, the salad. They used to call America the salad bowl, right? Then it became the melting pot, or it was the salad bowl. I don't know which came first. But that's the idea. When I have accountability, like we know that's actually what the beauty is of living in Israel, is you feel like it makes a difference, your opinion. You have an ability to affect your surroundings, and then you're invested in it.
Well, that's right. And I think one thing that I find really that strikes me in Israel now at the time of war, it's a small country and there is a very strong story, a very strong understanding. It's not a story, it's a very strong understanding of how important this country is for our people. And there is a sense of historical responsibility toward our people who lived powerless and stateless for thousands of years, and how it's very real. It becomes very personal and very real. Everybody takes responsibility for some part of protecting the country. Young people go to fight. I have to say, when I run into soldiers in the streets, on the trains, and I just feel so deeply moved, and like I don't even understand why these young people need to go and risk their lives to defend me, sitting in the city in my apartment. So I think in a way Americans maybe have lost that. So we failed to communicate that kind of sense of individual personal responsibility for the country that you're living in. And I think in the US is blessed in that it doesn't have enemies on its border. And all of its wars are conducted somewhere far away. And so maybe that's why it's not really so immediate. But we have to somehow make it real for people. I often think, and now it's becoming more and more obvious to me as I look at how old Soviet communist propaganda is popping up on social media and on the internet. And I think what a mistake it was that we never fully discredited the American Cold War enemy, the USSR and communism. Somehow, I think Americans just kind of went on. I mean, I came to the US just as it was all ending and the USSR was falling apart. And, people just went on with their lives. It was like, okay, well, we won. We won the Cold War. The USSR doesn't exist anymore. Forget about it. But we really should have taken the time to analyze who it is that we defeated and why it was so dangerous. Because truly, I mean, look, I have a great grandfather who was killed in Stalin's repressions, a completely innocent man. For all of us to be hearing what we're hearing now on social media, this whole communism was actually great, socialism was actually great, and that's what we need to strive for. It's shocking and it's actually painful because we have people we have family members who lost lives or were dispossessed or were, transferred to another part of the world or were starved to death, and to realize how much ignorance there is about that is really devastating. And now with the resurgence of this kind of communist anti-Zionism, you really see the danger of it. And again, it's intertwined with anti-American feelings. And this was a massive lost opportunity. Nazi Germany, when we defeated it, it was then fully discredited. The ideology was fully discredited. It didn't happen with Marxism, Leninism. It didn't happen with communism. And it was a big mistake.
I completely agree with you. And I wonder how much we learned about fascism in actuality. I mean, we learned about we saw the piled up bodies. We saw the results of it. We saw the carnage. But did we learn about the trickle until the exponential growth becomes a flood of what it means to slowly take away rudimentary rights of a human being's expression? And I think that that's spot on. That wasn't ever taught. And that's where we're coming here now and filling in the gaps. And just to step back just a moment, you discussed ideas and imagery from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Honestly, it has been the root of so much. If you just want to make a comment on that, Izabella.
Sure. Well, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, of course, were a Russian forgery. They claimed to be, that was produced even before the revolution, and they claimed to be essentially a transcript of a conversation that happened between the elders of the Jewish people who rule the Jewish people and who rule the world. I mean, if you believe in that, you obviously don't know anything about the Jewish people, right? That there are like some elders who run and rule us. But, what's interesting is I want to actually note this is that already back then, there were editions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and we're talking late 19th century, early 20th century, which claimed to be transcripts from the first Zionist Congress in Basel. So the first Zionist Congress, the Zionist movement terrified anti-Semites so much, they thought that this was the implementation of all of their fears. Now Jews are really going to come in and control the world. But so there was already an anti-Zionist kind of thread woven into this. But basically, yeah, it's a book that, that becomes a bestseller. It's translated into every language under the sun. And what's interesting is that the Nazis pushed it onto different people. They themselves believed it. And actually, there is a British historian who called the protocols a warrant for genocide. Essentially, it permitted the Nazis to commit the genocide. I mean, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's in a deep sense, it's true. But then the Soviets also took the protocols and they wove their ideas into their anti-Zionist propaganda. So even though the protocols are considered to come from the far right, the Soviets took them in the 60s and they essentially transformed them into the Marxist-Leninist critique. They knew that they couldn't sell them as they were to the global left because they were racist, right? They were reactionary, right-wing. But they took the ideas that the protocols had about Jews and they replaced them with the very same ideas, but about Zionists. So if the protocols talked about Jews controlling the world and the press and the media and the finances, financial flows of the world, they said the same about Zionists. So it's the same ideas. And you really see that very clearly in some of the Soviet cartoons, which I often show that in my lectures. You can see them actually. It's an article in Tablet that I have from 2019 about Soviet cartoons. And you can really see how a cartoon that calls itself anti-Zionist is ultimately deeply anti-Semitic. It's the same anti-Semitic ideas that had been there from time immemorial.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes. I actually have seen some of your lectures with that parade, with that spider, with the Star of David, that massive spider hanging over children walking the parade. It's
yes.
And you think, wait, what? It's from Russia? It's not from Nazi Germany? Wait, what?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is at a time, again, I often point this out in my lectures. This is that parade, the specific picture you're referring to is from early 1970s. And at that time, the protocols are prohibited in the Soviet Union. And Soviet constitution essentially prohibits any form of hate, racial hate. And yet, here they are essentially using the same ideas from the protocols that they're prohibiting in their in parades, in publications, in lectures, etc.
I think what's apparent is that this on its head, this inversion of dialogue, what Jews face, they are accused of, right? This, obviously, we won't begin to even get into it now, these accusations of genocide, having just experienced a by-the-book attempt minutes before. I don't know if you can shed any light, meaning we can see the phenomenon. It would be funny if it wasn't lethal. But what you described, this idea that Jews run the media, I'd like to talk to the Jew in charge because it's really not doing a very good job.
It's not working.
It's really gotta, fire that guy. Everywhere we face it, the turning everything on its head, the perversion of all of this from A to Z. Do you have anything to shed any light on it? We see the phenomenon, but why? Is it just this deep-rooted fear? They're worried about the 15 million Jews. They're still, we're only just now getting to numbers, ironically, of population of Jews on the planet that we had before the Holocaust. Just now. Maybe the world has they can only take so much. 15 million Jews, 8 billion people on the planet, 2 billion Muslims. I mean, country the size, you can't even get the word Israel on our place on the map. Right. What is the deal?
Well, I mean, look, I think you are asking a question I don't think anybody has an answer to. It's the question of, about the eternal nature of anti-Semitism. Why is it there? I don't think we know. Somehow it's woven into the fabric of society. But this thing with inverting everything, it's what's striking is, of course, when the Holocaust is inverted, and that is actually a term of art, Holocaust inversion, when Jews are called neo-Nazis and the Palestinians are called the new Jews, and then we're accused of perpetrating a genocide against the Palestinians. And again, it's not new. You see it in Soviet propaganda already in the 60s, this equation between Israel and Nazi Germany and Jews as the Nazis, it's already there 50 years ago. And it's one of the most popular memes today in the anti-Israel demonstrations. Deborah Lipstadt, who of course is the well-known academic and now the ambassador for, to combat anti-Semitism in the State Department, said that Holocaust inversion is essentially like a form. It contains a sort of. She uses the word a worm of Holocaust denial, because what it does is it diminishes, or it inflates to umpteenth degree what the Jews are doing, and it diminishes by the same degree what the Nazis had done to the Jews. So in essence, it's a form of Holocaust denial. And I think where I'm going with this is that I think that these inversions were there, I think, as a right-wing reaction to begin with to the Holocaust, and an attempt to deny the Holocaust, and an attempt to say the Jews did it to themselves and it's their fault and we didn't do it. Our Nazi friends didn't do it. They're not guilty. So I think it's a part of that, to say that Jews did it themselves. Jews did it themselves to their own people in the concentration camps. And where the left picks it up, and you see it again in Soviet propaganda, and that I described in my article about Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, is where they start to say that the Zionists did it. They start to talk about Zionist-Nazi collaboration, and they say that the Zionists are guilty and share the guilt with the Nazis for the murder of the 6 million people. It takes a really distorted thinking to come to this idea. And again, I explain it in that piece about Abbas's dissertation because he uses it in his dissertation as well. But I think ultimately it is an attempt to, I think for Soviets and for the left, it's an attempt to remove the victim status from the Jews. So the Holocaust supposedly kind of granted Jews this ultimate victimhood status. And so it was hard for the left to attack Israel without being called anti-Semitic. So they try to diminish the Holocaust by saying that the Zionists contributed to it so that they can then attack the Jews and not be called anti-Semitic. So in both cases, it's an anti-Semitic impulse to not be constrained but the tragedy that already happened to the Jews and to continue to attack them.
And October 7th was 1,000% a repeat of that.
Completely.
Within moments where you have the actual perpetrators GoProing real-time atrocities, absolutely unheard of the most savage degree, and they're denied. It's extraordinary, and it's devastating, not only as a Jew, but as a human being. And it should be to everyone.
100%.
Izabella, is there any other thing that you want to add to this conversation right now?
Well, I think I just want to reemphasize the point that what we're seeing today is something that has existed now for many decades. It has arrived in America, and Israelis experience it in that way through the international propaganda. And I think it's important to understand the history of it, or at least to recognize that there is a history, because once we do, then we recognize that what we're facing is propaganda. Because I think sometimes people have this inclination to get into discussions with the propagandists and try to explain to them how they're wrong. I mean, you can do it. It's just that it's a thankless task. You're just going to exhaust yourself. Sometimes I think it's helpful to just point out to propagandists that they're just propagandists, and they're being conspiracy theorists, just to not even engage, because you will not convince them of anything. And because they don't follow rules of logical reason, it's really unlikely that you will win by following logic and reason. So what I'm saying, I'm not saying don't give facts. I'm just saying direct your facts at other people. But with conspiracy theorists, just say to them that they're conspiracy theorists, or make fun of them, laugh at them, find ways to to circumvent the kind of the provocation that they're trying to create. And that, I think, that comes when you have that understanding that it's an unequal fight. We're fighting a body of kind of ideas and language that was created. It wasn't created by activists sitting in a garage in San Francisco on campus in Berkeley, California, who were these idealists who wanted to save the Palestinian people. No, this language was created by a cynical power, totalitarian power regime that wanted to use anti-Semitism for its and the feelings of anti-Semitism with different people in order to fulfill its foreign policy interests. It's important to understand it just for our own sanity.
100%. And we all know that there is no reason that the Palestinians living in Gaza or anywhere else should have been suffering for as long as they had, if not for the purpose that they serve. And That is 1,000% obvious. And I think that what you offer with actually, again, offering the source, meaning we have taken everyone's word for it. We have taken everyone's interpretation. And this is permission to explore and to welcome back the word Zionism. I mean, I made some comment the other day, Bob Marley, the icon, no, but seriously, the icon of peace sings about Zion day and night, right?
Yes, exactly.
So it is not inherently a dirty word, and it's ours, and we have permission to take it back to art.
100%. And we have to, that is one thing we have to do. If somebody somehow feels embarrassed by this word or embarrassed to call themselves Zionist, I think that after October 7th, especially, we have to not just take it back, but take it back with pride and wear it with pride and call ourselves Zionists. It's still, it doesn't matter how much they try to demonize it. It's still, its meaning is the same. And I think October 7th has shown it to us more than anything, that we need our state and we need our sovereignty and we need to be able to defend ourselves. And so, yeah, Zionism all the way.
Yeah. And I think that the same way that you couldn't convert in different attacks on Jews in the past, you couldn't convert out of being a Jew. You couldn't, there was no way out. And it's the same thing with this sort of pretense that Zionism is anything less than Jew hate. You can't not be a Zionist living in New Jersey. You're still under attack for all. And Izabella, while people are entrenched on pro-anti right-left sides, which really do no one any good, there is a vast majority of people in the middle who are simply uninformed. And it's those people who we speak to, because what we're imploring people is not come to my side. It's for God's sake, take accountability back for your own understanding, for the blessed analytical process, for the most human right of choice, to not just be flipped-flopped from side to side. Because this is, as I said earlier, the stakes could never be higher. We're talking about human life, and what love or hate the Jews is not for me to say, but history has always shown that when we have this manner of unhinged vitriol against Jews, it means society's decay is at a breaking point. It 100%. Is at a breaking point, and I am genuinely concerned for my people, for my country, but for the world, because we are on this beautiful green-blue rock all together, and we're going to have to figure 100%. It out. Yeah,
absolutely, 100%. The proverbial canary in the coal mine. This is precisely it. It shows the kind of cleavages and fissures that are just frightening. And this is to return to the question of how we need to be defending our democracy. We need to get really serious about it, defending the West, defending the democratic West. Liberal democracies, it's crucial.
It is crucial. This is not about any one state. This is not about any one people. This is about the structure of Western civilization, the structure of law and order, which however much they may have been broken or breached, are sound. This is about there being basic freedoms honored. This is about the ability to speak is the root of all of them, to speak freely. And
Yes.
that is what we are in defense of. And do not get confused by anyone narrowing that down. Western civilization is a beautiful thing, and it is a work in progress, and it requires every single one of us.
100%.
Izabella, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll come on again, and I wish you a microphone that we should all hear loud and clear.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it, and to be continued.
Awesome. Thanks, Izabella.